All right, wonderful. I want to welcome you all formally now that we started the recording and hope you're having a good afternoon, morning, evening, depending on where you are in the world. Um, I'm excited to have this opportunity to share with you some of the ideas that have come together in the last few years of training and 24 years or almost 25 years of practice. To give a little bit of context, I always like to start with just a little brief intro of how some of these ideas came to be, how some of the things that I'm going to be sharing with you started forming. And a big part of it, of course, like many of us, is personal story that we don't realize it until many, many years later, how it influences us. And I grew up in a family where there was a significant amount of addiction, substance abuse. And for the longest time, when I first started going to school and eventually training in Gestalt, I had made a promise to myself that I was never going to work with addiction, especially substance abuse. And it felt just too difficult, too complicated. Um, and at one point in my career, fairly early on, I was looking for something different. I was looking for a challenge. I had worked in a psychiatric hospital and other settings, had a private practice. And I knew someone that was working in a dual diagnosis outpatient program, so mental health and addiction, and decided that, it was time for me to try something new. And of course, as soon as I got there, I realized how much I loved that work and how interesting it was. Up until then, I have been doing a lot of work with trauma, even working with people with psychosis and the trauma sometimes that's behind it. And it just made sense when I realized, it was a new awareness for me then. I know it's a known awareness for a lot of us in the field that behind most addictions, there is trauma, there's unprocessed pain, and the addictive behaviors are a way of managing coping. So when that clicked in my head, suddenly addiction became very interesting, or more specifically, substance abuse at that point became very interesting because it was this sense that, okay, I know how to work with this. I could see the pain behind some of the behaviors and that people find ways of adapting and surviving that could be destructive. So it just made sense to me that this is something that felt much more connecting and much more doable. So as time passed and I started working in other fields and expanding my understanding of addictive behaviors beyond substances, that relationship between trauma and addiction became very apparent. But the initial motivation to do lectures and to present at conferences and eventually create these trainings, it actually came from something that became very figural for me, which was the need to change our paradigm of how we understand addiction, not just in Gestalt psychotherapy, but in the field at large. Because our understanding of addiction, first of all, most of the time we hear the word addiction and it sounds synonymous to substance dependence. And the reality is that there are many, many addictions that are not related to substances. And they are severely destructive for people's lives, especially now in the technological age where we have a phone in our pocket that is, has all these apps that are designed to be addictive. So there was this part of let's change our understanding of addiction. But the most important thing, and I'm not the only one that thinks this way, and there's a lot of people who have proposed this paradigm shift, but there was something about including some of the way that we work in Gestalt to the paradigm shift that felt really important. And the shift was moving away from the medical model of addiction, which is the most common understanding, which is addiction is a disease. More specifically, it's a brain disease that cannot be cured, and the only management is abstinence. So there was something about that was missing. And the best way that I have to describe it is to understand addiction from a functional perspective. So instead of seeing it as a pathology, to look at what is it doing for the individual in the present, and even more importantly, in their history, because there was a point that what we call addiction now, there was a moment in time that was the best possible option. It was a functional, creative adjustment that allowed that individual to survive, to adapt, to socialize, to numb, to disconnect, whatever it has been. So there's a really important sense that we need to also look at what we call addiction is giving the individual, not what it's taking. What is it doing for them? How is it benefiting them? And it was really interesting because that shift the therapeutic relationship significantly. So instead of seeing someone as this person who lies and manipulates and they want to keep on, engaged in their addiction no matter what, to shift the understanding as someone who has human emotional experiences that were not able to be processed, mostly related to pain that lives in the unspoken, which is what we call trauma. And therefore, they found these ways of surviving that became destructive in their life. So that's the essence of what felt really important for me. More than anything else is let's take a moment and shift our understanding of our perception of addiction, because it allows us to be relational with it versus treating a disorder or trying to change something. It allows us to engage with what might not be spoken, which eventually allows the possibility of sobriety or abstinence or whatever it be to become more possible versus a requirement for treatment, which is the other piece that I have found sometimes can be very destructive, because treatment programs can be very punitive with addiction. So there's a punishment that comes for relapses instead of an understanding of what that is serving. What is the purpose? What is the need that is being taken care of? So we're going to dive into some of these ideas as well as how this relates to trauma and some ideas on how to engage with this unprocessed experiences that come from this. I call it the compassional relational model, and it's an idea of integrating the importance of a compassionate relationship, not just therapist to client, but the client with themselves. So it's a bit of a snapshot of the ideas, of course. This is the introduction for the 6-module course that we're going to have later this year, in which we will dive much more into a lot of different parts of this and a little bit of neuroscience and certain things that today we just don't have the time to go over. So let me share my screen here so we could look at a couple aspects of this. So as we begin to think about addiction, one of the things that I already mentioned is that it's important for us to look at addiction beyond substances, to really pay attention to in what ways people find ways of anesthetizing or surviving or disconnecting or dissociating through engaging with something that's outside themselves. And when we think about that in this way, we begin to look at what are other possibilities and screens, the news, sex, falling in love, etc., money, success, work. They all can function in this way. So one of the challenges that I had through this process as I was beginning to engage with this was finding a definition of addiction that was more connecting with this idea of the function versus the disease. Because I remember when I started working in recovery, the definition of addiction that I would say so many times, there was a point that I could just repeat it in my sleep, was addiction is a continued use of a substance despite the negative consequences. So people continue to engage with substances despite negative consequences, which is close. It's an approximation to a definition that feels valuable. So through the process, I found a book that many of you might be familiar with. He's actually quite famous. Gabor Mate wrote this really wonderful book called In the Realm of Hungry Ghost. And I remember reading that book and finding this understanding of a lot of the things that I was seeing. It was almost a validating experience to see that there was a shared perspective in what he was writing. And in that book, Gabor has this definition of addiction that I think it's a good approximation to something that makes a little bit more sense in a relational way. I'm not still 100% convinced in it, but it's the closest thing that I have found, and I haven't been able to find something myself that it's more fitting. So basically, for us to define something as addiction, a behavior as addiction, there needs to be 3 basic components to it. The first is that it provides craving relief or pleasure in the short term. So it's either something that's very enjoyable and pleasurable for the individual. Most people, if not everybody that I have worked with in the last 24 years, who has an addictive relationship to anything, most of the time it's enjoyable to them. It might not sound enjoyable to me. It might not be something that I would feel that I would engage in pleasure, but for them it is. However, there is also this craving relief that for a lot of people, there's a relief that it comes from addictive behaviors. There's one addictive behavior that operates a little bit differently that's very common. I'll talk about it after I'm done with the definition. So engaging in this activity, behavior, substance, relationship, whatever it might be, eventually brings long-term negative consequences. So eventually, as time passes, there starts to be an impact in my relationships, in my function, in my health, in my ability to be present, whatever it might be. And then this is the third part, which makes this definition a little bit different than the rest. There's an inability or unwillingness to give it up. For me, that's a key component here because it's not that I can't, is that I'm unable or unwilling. And to give it up versus stop. So even though it's semantics, those words matter significantly because it's about giving something up. It's not just about stopping, it's about giving something up. So that begins to give us a glimpse of the relationship that it's a component of addictive behavior. So it's serving a purpose in my life. It's something that if I don't have it, it's hard for me to survive. It's hard for me to adapt. Oftentimes I think that the more severe the addiction, the more severe the pain that is anesthetizing. Of course, it's not a rule. There's no rules in our field. There's always exceptions. But for the most part, I have seen that the people who have the most destructive addictions have the most complex trauma stories in their life. So this idea of the inability or unwillingness to give it up, it's telling us that I need this. There's a part of me that needs this to survive. One of the things that's really important in this understanding of addiction from a functional perspective is that part of the work is to rescue the need from the behavior. What I mean by that is once we look at this part, the function, the relationship, why am I unwilling to give it up? For most people, the addictive behavior is taking care of a need, the need to belong, the need to soothe, the need to adapt, the need to be loved, the need to be protected, whatever it might be. In the brief, and sometimes that would last for seconds, sometimes it would last for hours, sometimes it would last long, but for a brief moment when I'm engaging with this addictive behavior, it fulfills a need. Now, it really doesn't, right? It just anesthetizes the need for a moment. But oftentimes people come, and I know I have had many clients that say, the problem is that I need constant validation. The problem is that I can't be alone. That's not the problem. To be validated, to belong, to be loved, to be seen, they're basic human needs. And if you think about a child, then we could really see them as basic human needs. It's the need to attach. I recently was watching a recording. Oh God, I can't remember her name right now. Sue Johnson, I think it was. And she was talking about attachment. And that was a very easy way of defining attachment that I really liked because sometimes with attachment theory, we can make it so complicated. And basically, a secure attachment is if I call for someone, someone comes. If I'm in need for someone, there's someone that responds. We need that as children, but we didn't still need it as adults. Not that we can't take care of our needs as adults, but it doesn't mean we don't need that relationship. We don't need the other in moments where I'm feeling some sort of desperation or when I'm having a hard time processing. So the need to belong, the need to be validated, the need to be loved, they're basic human needs. So oftentimes we need to rescue the need from the pathology that make people think that the problem is the need, not the way that I'm getting it satisfied. I remember working with a young man that was abusing heroin. And he said, every time I shoot up, I feel that I get the warmest embrace in the world. It's like my mom is hugging me. and I feel love for a few seconds. Then it goes away and the numbing begins. So that is the essence of it. And that's a very common story with heroin use. There's a lot of people who report something similar, like a warm blanket or a warm embrace. So needed that warm, loving embrace. It's a human need. So when we start looking at it from this perspective, we begin to shift that the work is not just giving up the addictive behavior. It's being able to rescue the need and understand the function. And also, to be fair, and I say this often to clients, nothing is going to be as quick and effective as the addictive behavior. The only difference is that we're training off the negative consequences and the fact that it evaporates. But in terms of the quickness that I take a drink and I immediately feel warm and disconnected, or I log on to my phone and I start looking at pornographic videos, and in that moment, everything disappears and I just feel this excitement and arousal about life. There's nothing that's going to be that immediate, but also not as short living. So I mentioned when I was going over the definition of addiction that there is one addictive relationship that's a little bit different than the rest. And that's the news, especially in today's world with 24-hour news cycles and news channels that are pre-programmed to create this echo chambers about our fears. So the way that the news, and this is not just of today, just we have the technology now to make it even more addictive. News trigger our fear response. And the addiction is not because of pleasure, it's because of misery. So I'm so afraid that if I don't know what's going on, something's horrible is going to happen to me. So there's an addiction to being on guard, to being protected, to being safe. But the way that I'm safe is by constantly hearing all the horrible things that are happening. And that gives me a false sense of security. So the news is one of the most addictive ways that people can engage, and it kind of goes under the radar because I'm just being informed. I just like knowing, it's just the news. Knowing about what's going on in the world is a good thing. But for a lot of people, they spend 6, 7, 8 hours a day on the news, and even more because they're constantly checking on their phone. They might be at work and they're constantly checking on their phone. I have a lot of clients that get home, make their dinner, sit in front of the TV, and watch news until midnight every single day because they need to be informed. So not only is social media extremely addictive and it's designed to be addictive, but also the news cycle is designed to be addictive, but it's just triggering fear and paranoia, which is sometimes much more harder to acknowledge than I'm doing this because it makes me feel good for a moment. So when we start thinking about addiction from this perspective of, craving relief, pleasure in the short term, negative consequences in the long term, inability or unwillingness to give it up, we start to see that there's a lot more that fits into this definition than just substances. And a lot of addictive behaviors are actually socially not just accepted, but glorified. Somebody who works, 80 hours a week, and they're very successful and their whole life is their profession. Sometimes they're admired, they're a hard worker, they're an excellent professional, they're this, well-known entity. But when we look at their life, they're not taking care of their physical health. It's impossible if you're working, 80 hours or more a week. They're not spending time with their family. They come home, they eat, and they go back to work. I have a lot of clients that they work full day, they come home, they play with their kids, for 10 minutes, have dinner, and then go back into their office and the computer until midnight and do that every day. And then on the weekends. So their spouses are unhappy. Their children are disconnected from them. Their physical health is impacted. They're not sleeping. They're not taking care of themselves. They're obsessed with success. And that's the only thing they think of. It takes over their mind and their everyday thinking. There is not a big difference between that and alcohol. Except that alcohol significantly changes your behavior and you start slurring your words. But beyond that, the consequences are very comparable. So when we start thinking about addiction in this broader sense, it allows us to be more inclusive of what are ways that people are adapting and surviving that might be destructive. So the best way to understand addiction from this functional perspective that I was referring to, it's to understand it from a developmental perspective, to look at the history. So oftentimes when I'm working with a client, they're, let's just say with alcohol to make it easy, they're talking about their drinking is out of control, and they're drinking every day a bottle of vodka and they can't function anymore. Oftentimes I will ask, when did you start drinking? And most of the time is, you know 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, sometimes 8, 9, depending. And that really gives us a glimpse to begin to understand this as a functional creative adjustment. What was going on when you were 12, 11, 13? What was happening in your life? And for most individuals in the beginning, engaging in this addictive behavior was a way that was very functional. A lot of them survived. It worked for them. It allowed them to have friends. It allowed them to socialize. It allowed them to be able to connect with people. And there's something really important. Obviously, some substances change the chemistry of the brain, but so does every other addictive behavior. So at the end, addiction is about changing brain chemistry. It's about being able to control my relationship with dopamine and oxytocin. So I get this sense of management, control, medicating, surviving that gives me a false sense of belief and connecting. Now, I have a good example of this with someone that I've been working with for a long time. And this is a kid who had a lot of really horrible things that happened early in his life. His father was murdered. His mom was not around. He was in foster care. Then he was adopted. And when he got to high school, he was having a really hard time socializing. He was having a really hard time finding a sense of belonging. And also he had like this constant rage. He was always angry. And rightfully so. He had a very difficult life. He went to a school that was very complicated. He's an African American male. He went to a school where he was constantly called the N-word and different things like that until they move him to a new school. So he gets into this more accepting school, and he is angry all the time. He's unable to socialize. And then he goes and finds this group of kids behind the school that are always open for enrollment and very welcoming. And they're also smoking weed on top of it. And he said, the first time I smoked, it was the first time in my life I was no longer angry. It made the anger go away. And suddenly he was able to socialize and be funny and have friends. And he started smoking every day. He started doing better in school. He had a girlfriend. He was finding a sense of belonging. He was doing great up until it triggered a psychotic episode. And his life began to crumble. And that's just about when I started seeing him. He was 17 at that point. I think he's like 28 now. But it really impacted his function. But that moment where I smoke marijuana and suddenly the anger is gone, I have friends, I'm able to be relational, people like me, that is functional. I mean, healthy and functional are two very different things. So we don't understand that part of the story. And we just look at, oh, it triggered psychosis. This is harmful for you. You need to stop. So, of course, when I started seeing him, he was still smoking. It took about a couple of years before he stopped smoking every day, and it was really impacting his health. If we just look at that piece, we're missing on what really helps us understand why he has this deep relationship with marijuana, which is it saved his life at one point. It really did. Unfortunately, that ends up with him having additional problems at the end, because not only does he have to deal with the trauma and the pain and the anger, but now he has to deal with the challenges of letting go of an addictive substance that he has this complicated relationship with. So Gabor Mate, once again, has this way of defining addiction in a very simple statement, which I agree with, and it sounds nice, which is addiction is not the problem, is the attempt to solve the problem. So that's a great way of simplifying everything that I'm saying up until this point, that it's not the issue at hand. It becomes problematic, of course. It becomes destructive, yes, of course. But it was the attempt to solve the problem, it was the attempt to have a sense of belonging, to have a sense of connection, to have a sense of wonder and relating and value and whatever it might be. Going back to what I said earlier, that when we look at it from this perspective of the fact that it is serving a need more than anything else. So I want to take a moment here and see if there's any thoughts, questions, perspective, anything that's come up for you that you want to share before we keep going. All right, wonderful. Every time that I stop and ask if there's questions, and there is one.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
I was surprised to hear about the addiction of news, and actually, I can really relate to that because in my country there is lots of news regards to the war threat in the country, and it's really getting a big problem that people are looking and looking more news and getting more and more anxious. So I never thought in this way of addiction, but it's a really interesting perspective.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and that's something that actually came from. It's a book by a guy from the Netherlands. It's called Humankind. It's a fascinating book. If you never read it, I can't remember the full name of it, but it's a fascinating book because he's basically challenged the concept that we have about human nature being destructive and aggressive. That's the principle of the book. Because in reality, when you look at the data, the opposite is true. And when you look at natural disasters and wars and things that happen, most people react in a way that they're helping their neighbor, they're supporting other people, they're not, running for their life and doesn't matter who they step on. The most common human reaction is quite opposite. So he goes into this whole, process of explaining why we have this belief, where they came from, and what the reality is. But anyway, he talks about in the beginning about the news being addictive and how it propagates this concept of human beings are destructive and horrible, and I need to be aware and afraid. So that's where that thought came from, and that awareness of how addictive it is and how it functions differently. But yes, I think I think sometimes I wonder, I don't want to go too much on a tangent, but sometimes I wonder, is the situation in the world much more dire now, or simply we just find out quicker? Because there's been a lot of horrible moments and wars and situations ongoing for a long time, but the problem is now we don't have to wait, weeks or months to find out. We find out in seconds, and that creates a different relationship with it. But coming back to this piece that you're sharing, is I agree that I see that in clients, right, much more. And every time, here in the United States with the election results for a lot of people, it was very stressful and scary, and continues to be every day. And I have clients that are constantly engaging with it, and it's so destructive. I stopped watching the news about 16 years ago because I realized that I only felt worse afterwards, even the local news. And I'm like, why am I engaging with something that is destructive for fun, in my free time? Good, thank you. I see there's some question here in the chat.
I found the
Yes.
author and I will put it in the chat.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Ed. Yeah, so the difference between the Gestalt approach to trauma and addiction versus the psychoanalytic approach. I think Andre's asking that. Sorry, I don't have my glasses on, so I'm having a hard time reading the chat. And it's helping me realize I need them because I don't think I need them, but now I'm realizing I do. So we're going to dive into a little bit more about the Gestalt perspective, but I think that the biggest difference is, at least from my vantage point, that when we're talking about it from a Gestalt perspective, is that we're looking at the function, we're looking at the relationship with the addiction, what need is it serving, how is, and also the active relationship with the addiction, because oftentimes when you hear people describe, in the training we go into more detail about this, but when you hear people describe when they engage with the addictive behaviors, a lot of the times is a very deep relationship, almost romantic. When you hear somebody describe, when they grab the cup and they put the ice on it and the clinking of the ice, and they grab the bottle of whiskey and they open it and the smell of the whiskey and the pouring it, and it starts mixing with the ice and the color of the amber and the sound it makes when it hits the glass and it mixes with the ice and the twirling of it in their hand, even before they taste it, there's already this engaging, very sensory, very deeply connected relationship with it. And that part of it is what it's so important to understand, right? And I think that one of the things that Gestalt does really well is that instead of looking at just pathology, we look at what is the purpose of this. Well, how is depression serving me versus just hurting me? And that's the idea here, that relational moment that's so intense, it's worth discussing, it's worth exploring, it's worth talking about. So more than the underlying subconscious need for addiction, it's actually the very present, obvious relationship with the addiction that matters. The very obvious present function. The challenging thing that I see with a lot of clients is that when we start looking at what does addiction give you, especially there are individuals that have already had a lot of damaging results in their life, in the beginning that can sound like the craziest idea in the world, right? What do you mean what I get out of addiction? And so some people even get angry because it's like, it's not serving me, it's destroyed my life. I have lost my family, I've lost my job, whatever it might be. But yet, when we look at it from a different perspective, it becomes quite evident that it's serving a purpose. It might be a 15-second purpose, but those 15 seconds are pretty intense and alleviating and welcoming, and that intensity is worth it. So when we start looking at what is it that this addiction is managing, it's when we start to see that relationship with trauma, right? And I want to take a moment to share my perspective on trauma, because I think that there's so much conversation about trauma. It has become one of the most, in book topics in the field of psychology in general. And the more that we understand, the more it's evident that if you're not dealing with trauma in any psychotherapeutic way, you're missing a lot of components. And there's this old conversation, especially in the United States, there's like big T and little t traumas and all this stuff, right? That begins to like give you a sense of how do we measure trauma. I personally disagree with that. I don't think that big T or little t trauma is the best way of understanding it or helps too much. My perspective is a little bit different, and I use this example often. Some of you might have heard me say this before, but if you think about this bottle of water and imagine this is a soda can instead, so made out of aluminium, and I get this big rock and I throw the rock against the can, it's going to be affected. It's going to be reshaped. The can's going to look different. It's going to function different. And the benefit of the big rock is that I could grab the rock and pretty easily have a relationship between the rock and the impact on the can. Trauma can sometimes be that way. The significant horrific events that happen in our life that have an impact on us. And that impact, when it's war, abuse, fires, whatever it might be, a lot of times there's like, yeah, this thing happened and it had an impact in my life. Most common, it happens a little bit different. If I take the same can and I constantly hit it with pebbles, just little rocks, one after the other, just one after the other, eventually it's going to look very different. It's going to be reshaped, it's going to be impacted. The challenge is that it's almost impossible to find what little rock caused the dents. So the only way to understand it is to look at the pile. And then I could see, yeah, no matter if this was impactful. That's the most common experience of trauma. And what are those rocks? Relational patterns, multi-generational themes, high pressure situation, absent parents, emotional disconnect, not having someone available when I needed them. And what that creates is this sense of, and going back to the insecure attachment, but Jim Kepner talks about this in his book, Healing Task, that when the people that are supposed to keep us safe are the ones that are hurting us, it really creates a disruption, because then there is no one that is safe. Oftentimes when I'm working with someone and they share, an experience of abuse in childhood or sexual abuse in childhood, I normally ask the same question: who did you tell? And you could probably guess what the most common answer is: no one. Sometimes it's worse, they did tell and it was not believed, or there was shame, which is even worse. But most of the time, the essence of trauma is that horrible things happen, painful things happen, and I have no one to tell. That is the essence of trauma. Not that the event is not horrific, but there was no one safe enough that I could go to with my pain. And the only way that I had for surviving it is by internalizing it, by disconnecting from it. Because trauma thrives in the unspoken. It propagates in darkness. That's where trauma lives. So the essence of trauma is that it's pain that cannot be shared or spoken, and it just encapsulates as a reality. So it's important to have that, because I think oftentimes with trauma we get so caught up in the event. Not that it's not important to talk about the event, but it's much more about the long-term consequences of that event, the present sense of how that's impacting my life. So most often there are four aspects of trauma, four ways that trauma is often impacts adulthood, and we want to put it in some sort of context. The first part of that is that there's a loss of response flexibility. What that means is that my ability to adapt, if we want to think about it from a Gestalt perspective, the figure ground formation becomes very rigid. I'm not able to adapt to different situations. My world becomes very small, because my ability to respond to multiple experiences, to be flexible depending on life situations, becomes very rigid. Because what hurts, what's painful, it's too big, it's too broad, it's too overwhelming. So I have to stay within this limited way of adapting and adjusting to the world. So my ability to adapt, to be flexible, is severely impacted. There's a fundamental disconnected from the self. I mean, the essence of the self, we have so many ways of defining it, and it can get very philosophical, but the easiest way for me to understand it is that when I experience trauma, it's not possible, especially significant complex trauma, there is a disconnect from my body. My ability to be in my body gets severely impacted to the point of full dissociation, or any degrees between that and not being connected. And Bessel van der Kolk has a really great book, The Body Keeps the Score. And just the title is great enough to understand this concept, right? Our body keeps the score of what happens to us. So if I cannot be in my body, if I cannot experience an embodied sense of self, it makes it impossible to fully connect with the essence of me, because I cannot be in my body, because the body holds the pain. This is actually a really important awareness to have when we're working with someone, that we need to really pace ourselves, Because oftentimes we might go too quickly to embodied experiences or work with our senses or our body. And for a lot of people, that's the worst thing that could happen in the world, because I'm suddenly connecting with this pain that I've been, finding creative ways of surviving and not being with it, and suddenly is there, and that could be extremely overwhelming. So the other aspect is that it shapes how I see the world. And we clearly see that with individuals in terms of what's safe, what's threatening, what I'm able to do, what is not. Even who I fall in love with is significantly impacted in this way. The term for it in the trauma world is trauma bonding, right? So we find someone that fits into our story, not always in this full conscious awareness, and I'm constantly experiencing this sense of being abandoned, and the other person is constantly feeling overwhelmed by being grabbed onto. I see that very often in couples, right? They play up perfectly out their trauma stories, and they become the worst possible reality of their fears coming true. And finally, which I think is one of the most detrimental aspects of trauma, is that it makes it virtually impossible for me to be in the present moment. So I am not seeing the world through my adult eyes. I'm not seeing the world through my present sense of self. I'm seeing it from past experiences, from the hurt child, from the angry adolescent. So it's almost impossible for me to be objective. The best example I have for this is a personal story. So whenever I go to events that have large groups of people, the best example I have is conferences, right? So if you are in the US and you ever been to the NADAC conference, there's like 1,000 people, or in Europe, the EAGT conference, there's a massive group of people. I feel extremely overwhelmed and very scared. It's almost like everybody's an adult and I am not. I'm a fairly tall person, in centimeters, I'm 1.88 meters. In feet, I'm like 6'3". So I'm a fairly tall man. And when I'm there, I literally feel like I'm looking up to everyone, and everybody's an adult and I'm not. It's a physical sensation of not being in my adult body. And of course, it comes from experiences in childhood and social settings in school and different things, a sense of not belonging. So it's almost, and it makes it impossible for me to talk to people, right? Because it's like they're adults, they know what they're doing. I'm not, I shouldn't be here. I used to get very angry at myself for that and be like, what the hell's wrong with you? You're in your 40s, you're a therapist, you shouldn't be feeling this way, until I found this way of being a little bit more compassionate with myself through my own therapy and work. And now I take some time and figure out my choices. Do I find someone to talk to? Do I don't? Do I stay quiet? Do I want to talk to people, right? Do I want to muster the energy to engage with someone? And sometimes I choose not to, and it's quite enjoyable to walk around talking to no one for 24 hours. And sometimes I do talk to people, and it's also enjoyable. So that's why I mean, it's impossible to be in the present moment. It makes it very difficult for me to engage as an adult and be able to relate to people from that perspective. So for me, this is the closest thing I have to defining trauma. If I was too bold to try to say that we can define it, but trauma is not what happens. It's not the event nor the situation. Trauma is the internal imprint of the aftermath of pain without empathic support. That is the essence of it. That there is no one to tell. There was no one to connect with, which really highlights why the therapeutic relationship can be so valuable in such an important place. Because for a lot of people, it's the first time that they can engage with someone who's present in their pain and who is willing to listen. And it's not about changing it. It's not about modifying it. Oftentimes when I'm working with people, supervision or trainings or whatever, I often say the most important thing we could do with pain is to be with it, to support it. We don't need to change it. We don't need to say a lot. We don't need to make it better. We just need to honor it. Because what happens often is when people are sharing for the first time a painful experience, if we go into trying to do something to alleviate it or make it better, it actually doesn't help. It just makes it go back into hiding. So I remember I used to say a long time ago, whenever I used to teach, that part of our job is to learn to be comfortable with uncomfortableness. And with time, I have changed that, because it's not about being comfortable. Sometimes it's just about being uncomfortable with uncomfortableness, right? And staying with it and staying with that discomfort. Because comfortable might disconnect, might not be a correct way of relating, or not correct, authentic way of relating with pain. Because when somebody shares something horrific, it's horrific to hear it, but it doesn't mean we cannot honor it. Pain actually is one of the most intimate relational expressions. We have somebody that we could share our pain with, truly share our pain with. It's beautiful intimacy. It's close approximation to another human. I mean, Martin Buber said it many, many years ago in the best way possible. We need others to heal. Healing happens in relationship, not in isolation. So that's such an important piece of this sharing pain, that it's in connection with another that I'm able to heal. I remember somebody said this to me a while ago, and I can't remember who. It was just in a conversation, that it's a realization that a lot of people have had, I'm sure. But if you think about it, I am the only person that I will never see with my own eyes. I can see my reflection, I can see my picture, I can see myself in the video, but I cannot physically see my face. I can see everybody else's except for mine. So that's something that tells us something about human relationship. I really need others to fully see myself, or at least a mirror, which is another, to fully see myself, and it's only a reflection. So that part of relationship, such a key component of healing, of connecting. I want to say something about healing, because I think that the best definition, the best way of understanding healing, and once again, it comes from me paraphrasing something I heard Gabor Mate say. Healing is when I'm able to realize that I can make space for pain and other unpleasant emotions like anger or sadness or whatever, and that moment ends. That is the essence of healing. That I realize that the moment of discomfort passes and life continues. The opposite of that, Thich Nhat Hanh says that when we run away from pain, we run into suffering, and that never ends. I was working with someone yesterday, and there's a young man in his 30s who is had a very unhealthy relationship with alcohol and cocaine and marijuana. He's been sober for 90 days now, and he was talking about this moment that he recently had where he had an argument with his sister. He felt really horrible, really sad, and realized at that moment I would have gone for a drink, and I didn't, and the moment ended. Right? That is the essence of healing. It felt horrible, but then it passed. And then the next day, life went on and I was able to continue. Where before, it would have just been one more thing to drink about and prolong forever. So that's the essence of the difference between pain and suffering. One ends, the other doesn't. There's another really beautiful definition of addiction. This one comes from Stephen Porges. If you're familiar with the polyvagal theory, Stephen Porges is the creator of the polyvagal theory. And he has a very, very beautiful, simple definition of trauma. Trauma is the chronic disruption of connectiveness. That's it. That's the essence of it. It's chronic, it's fairly ongoing and permanent. And it disrupts my ability to connect with others, with myself, with the world, with my body, etc., etc. So it's a chronic disruption of connectiveness. Now, as we put some of this together, this is the best way that I have of putting some of these thoughts together through this diagram right here. So when we look at the green side, there are pleasurable activities or craving relieving activities that in the moment allows just an enjoyable or, relieving experience. Sex, substances, uh, success, being accepted, falling in love, whatever it might be. That by itself, of course, is not problematic, right? I mean, there's a lot of enjoyable things that trigger that reward system in our brain that are wonderful. They're great. We don't want to lose them. On the other side, we have trauma, unprocessed, unexpressed emotions, broken attachments, whatever it might be. It's simplified pain, painful experiences that have an impact in our life. That is unfortunately just part of living. We are going to explain we're all going to experience dissolution, pain, moments of sadness, moments of misconnections, whatever it might be. Once again, having those experiences does not mean we're going to have addictive behaviors. It's not a guarantee. It's just part of life. What happens often is that the more significant there is that sense of disconnect, lack of safety, lack of connecting, my social environment, there's no really secure attachments or minimal secure attachment, very rigid expectations, and so on. We create ways of being and adapting in this fixed beliefs or fixed gestalts about ourselves. I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough, I'm not valuable enough. Because in a moment that allows us to engage and attach to our world. As time passes, and for most of us, once we get to adolescence, we get to this very complicated age, as I was referring to my client earlier, where finding a way of belonging and being part of a group becomes the most important thing for most adolescents. And when I'm carrying a sense of shame, not good enough, not valuable, all these complicated ideas and concepts of myself, that social fear is overwhelming and so hard to connect. This is one of the ways that this is experienced. Of course, it's not the only. And then, like my client, I find the kids behind the school or in the woods or whatever who are always open for a roam and they're welcoming. I start smoking weed or drinking or whatever it might be, or I fall in love, or people are suddenly attracted to me sexually and I get a sense of validation, or I'm successful in sports and then that becomes my identity, whatever it is. At that point, it is not a pathology. It's not unhealthy. It's a functional creative adjustment that allows me to adapt, survive, to manage. And for a lot of people, that's it. That's all it is. It's just a moment in time that I've found a way of surviving and adapting and it does not continue. But there's a lot of folks where it continues beyond this point. And as you see, the lines become merged. They start to be so intertwined that at one point it becomes almost impossible for me to be in life without that compulsive behavior that helps me survive. Because it's so intertwined that if I don't have that engaging behavior that we call addiction, all I'm left with is the pain. All I'm left with is the memories, the discomfort, those things that I cannot manage, those concepts of self that are so overwhelming. The same client that I was telling you earlier about the shooting up was the warmest hug. As he was starting to see, maybe I do need to stop, he said to me, "You don't understand. If I stop using heroin, I will die." He didn't mean physical death necessarily, but just that he could not manage what he knew was there. He did eventually get sober. He actually had to go into a residential program for a bit. And as we started working through what was there, it was horrific trauma. He had gone through horrific things. He was sexually abused. He was adopted. He had gone through a lot of pain. Unfortunately, he was adopted older and he grew up in a very horrific environment. He was actually adopted from Russia. And his situation at home was quite horrific. He came to the United States, and the family that adopted him was also highly dysfunctional. So unfortunately, he didn't come to a better place. So there was so much pain in his life that he never felt that he could not just even like hold it, but acknowledge it to another human being. Because there's something about spoken experiences that make them true in a very different way, because I'm hearing myself say it which is very different than just thinking it. But there's this essence that is quite beautiful, which is that human experiences are mentionable. And when they are mentioned, they become more manageable, which then, if we find somebody safe to share it with, they actually become more human. That's actually me paraphrasing. For those in the United States know Mr. Rogers. Yeah, somebody just texted that. So Mr. Rogers was this, for those of you that are not in the United States, he's a man who had this kids program for many, many years. And he was like the sweet, kind uncle that told stories and whatever, and he was actually quite, from the stories that are known of him, quite a wonderful man. So he had a similar quote that I just paraphrased about human experiences, which is quite beautiful. What's interesting is that he was telling children that, but it applies to every single one of us, that the reality is that what's human is mentionable. Now, as there's a couple of things that I want to share here before we move into the questions. In the process of the training, there's, as I said earlier, we go into a lot more details of what I just, ran through really quickly with just some general ideas about it. But the essence of the training is, once we have this understanding, what do we do with it? Right? Because at the end of the day, there is that piece. One of the things that I often say when I'm training is that what's even more important than the what is the how. So we, in the field of psychology in general, when you look at it, this is true in the United States, but I talk to people from different parts of the world, and it's true there to some extent as well. We have become about pathology and technique. So for this diagnosis, you do this. For this situation, you do this. And especially in the United States, where we're overwhelmingly controlled by CBT and evidence-based stuff, where, I'm not saying evidence-based is a problem, but it becomes very, very technical. And for me, what's really the most important, and I think this is why I was drawn to Gestalt so many years ago, the most important part of the relationship is the relationship, is how we are with the client more than what we do. Because oftentimes, if the relationship is connected and it's safe, there's a sense of shared experience and co-created field. The what we do just happens, right? I'm sure you know this. There's been countless amount of studies that have been done where they see what is the most effective, type of therapy and whatever. And the most common denominator is that people say what really helped the most was that I trusted this person, that I saved them, that I liked them, that I felt engaged. The relationship is what matters. Because the reality is that most clients have no idea if you're a Gestalt therapist or not, nor do they care if you're a Gestalt therapist or not. They just know they feel safe with you. So I say that because we're about to talk about some of the whats, but the most important thing is the how. So this is a really brief overview of a big part of the training is this idea that I call the relational Gestalt compassionate trauma model. Believe it or not, that's the short title. It used to have a much longer title, and I had to, do a lot of creative storming to figure out a title is a little bit shorter. So the idea here, and I love the analogy of the tree. At one point, it used to be a list, and that just didn't seem right. Because this is not meant to be necessarily stages, but it's more of an understanding of, for a tree to grow, there's certain things that are needed: ground, water, nutrients, right? So at the beginning, this idea of the ground for the tree to grow is what I call safety and stabilization. Not just me, a lot of people call it that, which is basically, does the client have enough resources to even begin to explore the possibility of sobriety and or trauma work, and eventually trauma processing, which are two different things. Trauma work for me starts day one, when we're supporting people with making connections, with building awareness, with looking at the function of addiction. Trauma processing is when we get to actually address the events that might have been painful or destructive. And that for many people comes way, way later. So before we do anything, we have to have enough ground to stand in. So that's the development of the relationship, the working on being able to stay in the present moment, to stay in their body, to have enough sense of connection and safety. Jim Kerner calls it the self-function phase, where we're developing this ability to, be aware and be connected and regulate and express, and and all those things are really important. After that, which I really think for me is the most important part of all of this, is the trunk, and that's the how. And a tree without a trunk is just a bunch of leaves and twigs, right? So in order for this to be a tree, it requires a trunk. And the trunk is validating the experience and witnessing and communicating. What does that mean? It's very simple, but yet such an important component. It's truly to be a witness of the other's story, life, perspective, phenomenology, what is being shared, context and content, all of it. Because to be a witness is to listen with more than my ears, to see with more than my eyes, to offer a sense of presence and genuine sense of being with the other. That for me is actually the most important thing of all of it, because it's where the sense of being seen, of being heard, is such an important path. I was working with this woman, and she was talking about the sense of the challenge of belonging. This is an African American woman. She was talking that, and she's a therapist. So in walking into fields, groups, there's mainly a lot of white people, in the sense that I immediately don't belong. And as we're working through this, she connected with this really beautiful sense of something that has been passed on from generation to generation to generation, which is the best way that you stay safe is by not feeling safe, right? Because if you do, then you stop being on guard. At the same time, she said, but I'm tired of that getting in the way of me being able to relate. And when she was able to access how this is multiple generations passing on a way of protecting, it was very moving. And she was surprised by her tears. And she said, I'm noticing that I'm crying, and it's very interesting. And really, just as an instinct, I said, and notice that I see your tears too. And that's what I mean by witnessing. It's not just I'm here. It's just truly witnessing that I am seeing your tears as well. And that essence of relationship, as after we spoke afterwards, there was this sense that was like the part that felt the most connecting. What's fascinating about that is that most of those moments are just simple human moments. They're not techniques. They're not, training. I mean, I guess the training is to give ourselves permission to say it. So there's something very essential about that aspect of witnessing and communicating, because it's not just with words, it's with presence, it's with our felt connection with the other. The other aspect of that, in the bottom of the tree there, it said validate the experience, and in parentheses, believe. That's it. Our job is to believe and validate what the other person is saying. Even if it sounds far-fetched, even if it sounds really convoluted, especially very early trauma, a lot of the times the way it's remembered, it's very distrust and very weird, and some of the stories don't match and the ages don't match. It doesn't matter. If somebody's actively lying to me, I don't care. Because if they need to lie and we need to work with the lie for a while, the truth will eventually be shared. But it's much more important to me what was happening, that this is how you relate through lying, more than what's the truth. So the essence is that as we validate the other's experience, and we truly are sitting there in a sense of acknowledging and believing, communicating and witnessing and being active in that, that's the essence of the work beginning to grow. That's what's going to hold what comes next. That's what's going to allow for things to grow and develop. It's the essence of contact that is so important. I have this idea that a prerequisite for contact, especially when we're doing work with clients, is our willingness to be vulnerable as clinicians. Because if we're not willing to be vulnerable, which means putting something of ourselves into it, letting ourselves be impacted by the other, it's hard to do really relational therapy. I had the luck to live in the same city that Herb Polster, and I had the opportunity to have a relationship with him for about 24 years, and I would go visit him and have lunch with him, and he shared with me that one of the times that, I don't know if this is something that's officially quoted, but they ask, or is something that he had a lesson with Fritz, but he said that Fritz said that if at the end of therapy you are not changed, you did not do Gestalt therapy, right? And that's the essence of that. That I need, and a part of me needs to be in this relationship for something to be co-created. Now, I'm just gonna briefly go over this. The rest of the tree, it's more of the ways that we engage in the work. This is not something I did on purpose. I didn't realize this until many years or months later, after I turned this into a tree diagram, that on the right side we have kind of like that top down way of working. So the understanding to be able to then connect with our bodies. So we're exploring those fixed beliefs, the ways that I adjust to the world, what I learned to believe of myself in order to integrate to my family or to the world. And this thing that I call making space for the antagonist is basically exploring the ways that I interrupt, the ways that I disconnect or dissociate. It's traditionally called resistance, but I don't like calling it resistance. I go into detail about this in the training. I think what it really is the antagonist that interrupts the story. So somebody's beginning to share something and there's this deep emotion, and suddenly they say, this is a wasted time. This is so stupid. It happened when it was said. Why are we talking about that? It's not resistance. It's an interruption that is necessary to adjust, because that adjustment has helped them survive. Disconnecting and thinking this is stupid probably was the best choice it had at one point in our life. So the idea is that instead of trying to go around it or avoid it, we lean into it. We get to know it. We welcome, let's welcome the interruption. What is this part telling you? What is the purpose, etc. Of course, I'm oversimplifying it right now, and we can talk about it in a moment if there's questions. And on the other side, it's more of that bottom up processing. So working with emotions, working with the body, processing what's happening in the body. Now, and then the very top is exploring meaning. I'll talk about that in a moment. Let me take this down. So when I talk about body awareness and processing, here's the most interesting part of that. It really doesn't matter too much what type of body work you do. Somatic experiencing, Gestalt trauma work, EMDR, whatever it is. It's more the awareness that is part of the processing. That we're not working with the body eventually. That we're not working in the embodied experience of the pain or unprocessed pain. We are not fully connecting with the impact that trauma had in somebody's life. Before we get to the body, we need all of that ground and dirt and minerals and trunk and all that. Because if we get there too soon, it's too much to destabilizing. So the essence is, it's more about the awareness that body work is needed more than how we do the body work, because there's so many great ways of doing it and so many great trainings about it. So it's not about what are we doing, is more the importance that it's a necessary step, or let me say that in a better way. It's a necessary component, not a step, to healing pain. And that body awareness could be as simple as, oh yeah, I feel it in my heart right now and it feels tense. It could be that, right? Because clients have different reference points of how much they're able to embody and express. So it doesn't have to be this huge cathartic experience. It doesn't have to be moving around and punching something. It could be that for some people, but for the most part, it's just noticing how it's in my body before and after. That's significant. That's important. That's the essence of it. And at the very top of the tree, I have exploring meaning. The reason is at the very, very top, because for me, that's almost a consequence of this work, is the transcendence of pain. Like, oh, suddenly, like my client, it's like, now I see that the pain ends. And that unpleasant moment with my sister passed. I didn't drink. And then the next day I could, see it as an event that happened. Maybe I didn't talk to her more, maybe I don't, but it's not this overwhelming life is crashing down on me. That's the essence of meaning. It doesn't have to be, now I see the world in bright yellow where before it was, dark brown. It could be that, but it doesn't have to be that. Now, and in the training, we'll engage much more deeply with some of the aspects that are here. This is the part of the lecture that it's a blatant commercial. I like to say that so it doesn't feel like I'm just doing something that is not genuine. But just so you know, you're probably aware of this already. These are the dates and the different modules. Actually, the modules have been renamed. I just noticed that it still has all the old titles. It's a little bit different now. But basically, we go into this deep, much more deeper understanding of some of the things that we talked about. We look into polyvagal theory. They look a little bit into neuroscience. We look into different ways of understanding addiction, how to work with it, and then we do some of the how do we integrate this model. In the trainings, we do a little bit of group stuff, but I do normally 3 modeling sessions at different moments to share some of the ideas of the work. So the idea is that it's not just a bunch of lectures. We try to make it interactive and also have the opportunity to see some of the parts that are connecting to this piece. Before we end the formal lecture part and we go on to questions and we turn the recording off, there's one piece that it's always important for me to talk about whenever I get the opportunity to have somebody who's willing to listen, which is the essence of hope. Now, hope for me is something that it's important to be mindful of. And when I say hope, I'm not referring to, things are going to be okay kind of hope. That's a nice line for a greeting card or something. For me, hope is much more gritty and much more, it comes in micro moments or micro doses, is what I need to grab onto in order to keep on doing this work, in order to keep on, even like going through my own processes as human. The reason this is important is that when we're working with deep disconnect and pain and people who have survived through disconnecting, through addiction, and there's a lot of times a lot of hopelessness. Now, hopelessness has a purpose, of course, and it serves a very well purpose. I have a friend who said that hopelessness is the warmest blanket in the world because there is nothing safer than thinking nothing is possible, so why even try? Miserable, but safe. So grabbing onto hope is challenging, it's difficult. And it includes moments of hopelessness for myself too. I have found that to be true, that sometimes I need to go into the darkness to come back up. But for me, the essence of hope is not forgetting that the work that we do, it's important and valuable, that each person that I'm sitting with is important and valuable, but more so that humans are worth it, that human beings are worth it, that this planet is worth it, especially with all the bombardment of the geopolitical situation in the world and the horrible wars that people are experiencing. It's important to look at the dark side, but not to forget to look at the other side. Because for me, that's where the essence of hope is, that despite the horrible things that sometimes humans do to humans, as a whole, we're worth it. And is worth connecting and is worth engaging. I tell this story often. So if you heard it before from me or someone else, it's a story that I think is worth retelling. Somebody told me this when I was 20 or something like that. No idea if it's true or not, but I like the principle. So basically, the story goes like this. There's a man who goes out for a morning run, and he lives by the beach. And the previous night, there had been high tide, so the sand was covered with starfish. So he's starting his run, and he sees this little 6-year-old boy that is grabbing the starfish, grabs one, throws it back to the water, grabs another one, throws it back to the water, and he's just going back and forth. So the man goes on his run, comes back about 60, 90 minutes later, which I'm told by people that run that's a real time that people run for all an hour or more. So anyway, he comes back and the little boy is, still going, grabbing stars, throwing them in the water. So the man's looking at him and he's curious now. And he asks the little boy, "What are you doing?" And the boy says, "I'm saving the starfish." So the man looks at the water and it's like hundreds of them, if not thousands. He says to the boy, "But you will never finish. And besides, who cares?" And the boy says, "This one cares," and throws it back into the water. Grabs the next one and says, "This one cares," and throws it back into the water, and so on. So that's the essence for me. We cannot touch everyone. We might not be able to connect or support everyone, but the people we touch and touch us are worth it. Not just in our work, but in our life, in our connecting with people. In me being with you now, there's an essence of hope. Because you're willing to spend part of your Saturday talking about trauma and addiction. That means something. So that's the essence that for me is worth grabbing onto to continue doing this very difficult, challenging work that we do. So with that said, that's the formal part of our time together ends. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording now and just give some signs for us to have a conversation.